In 1881, the city of Tombstone, Arizona Territory, passed Ordinance No. 9. It prohibited the carrying of deadly weapons within town limits. Bowie knives, dirks, pistols, rifles, all of them banned north of a line the locals understood. You could carry your weapon into Tombstone, but you had to hand it over to a licensed house or a city officer before you walked its streets. The most famous gunfight in American history, the shootout near the OK Corral, was not a battle between good and evil. It was, at its legal core, an argument about gun control. The Earps were enforcing a municipal firearms ordinance. The Clantons and McClorys were violating it. That single fact, verifiable in the Cochise County records, unravels nearly everything you were taught about the American cowboy. And once that thread pulls loose, the whole fabric comes apart. What you find underneath is stranger, harder, more human, and more interesting than anything John Wayne ever put on screen. Start with what a cowboy actually was. Not the figure on the poster, the person on the payroll. The open-range cattle drive era lasted roughly 20 years, from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the catastrophic winter of 1886 to 1887. 20 years. In that compressed window, an estimated 35,000 men worked the trails from Texas to the Kansas railheads: Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, Dodge City, Caldwell. Their average age was somewhere in the low to mid-20s, though plenty were younger. Many were teenagers. Partial records from outfits like the XIT Ranch and the King Ranch show substantial numbers of hands aged 16 to 22. Their pay was roughly $1 a day, $30 a month, plus food. That is not a gunslinger's wage. That is the wage of a migrant agricultural laborer doing dangerous, monotonous, unglamorous work in heat, dust, and isolation for months at a stretch. The mythology that replaced this reality started almost immediately. Dime novels in the 1870s invented fictional gunfighters and square-jawed lawmen. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, touring from 1883 to 1913, staged trick-shooting exhibitions and mock battles that had almost nothing to do with ranch work. By the time Hollywood picked up the template in the early 20th century, the cowboy had been fully reimagined. White, solitary, morally clear, perpetually armed, and dangerous. Every single element of that image is wrong. Let's take the gun first, since that is the center of the myth. A Colt, single-action Army revolver, cost between $12 and $17 at retail in the 1870s and 1880s. On a wage of $25 to $40 a month, that represents roughly half a month's earnings. Ammunition was an additional ongoing expense. Many working cowboys simply did not own a revolver. It was not a practical tool for daily ranch work. A rifle was more useful for predator control or dispatching an injured animal, but even rifles were not universal. Look at period photographs of actual working cowboys, not the posed studio portraits where a man borrowed a gun and a clean hat for the camera, but the candid shots taken on ranches and at railheads. You will see men without visible firearms more often than men carrying them. And when those cowboys rode into the cattle towns after months on the trail, the ones who did carry a weapon were expected to check it. Dodge City's 1878 ordinance required visitors to deposit firearms upon entry. Wichita, Abilene, and Caldwell had similar regulations. The motivation was not ideological, it was commercial. Merchants wanted cowboys spending money in shops and saloons, not shooting holes in the ceiling. Picture it: a wooden sign at the edge of town, a deputy behind a desk, a shelf with cubby holes. You unbuckle, you hand it over, you get a claim ticket. The Wild West, in its actual cattle towns, had stricter gun laws than most modern American states. That changes the arithmetic of violence entirely. Robert Dykstra, in his landmark 1968 study of the Kansas cattle towns, went through police records, coroner's reports, and newspaper accounts across all 5 major cattle towns for the entire period, 1870 to 1885. He found 45 homicides total, across 5 towns, over 15 years. Dodge City, the most violent by reputation. The Dodge City of 100 movies and 1,000 dime novels, averaged about 1.5 killings per year during its peak cattle trade period. 1.5. The classic quick-draw duel, 2 men facing each other on a dusty street at high noon, has essentially no documented occurrence in Cattletown records. None. Most killings were the result of drunken arguments, ambushes, or law enforcement confrontations. The face-to-face showdown appears to have been invented by Owen Wister in his 1902 novel The Virginian, and Hollywood cemented it into the national imagination from there. The most iconic scene in Western cinema was created by a novelist, not by any actual cowboy. Now a fair point. Dijkstra studied cattle towns, not the entire West. Roger McGrath, studying the mining towns of Bodie and Aurora, California, found much higher violence rates. Mining camps were different from cattle towns. Remote settlements were different. The West was not uniformly peaceful, but the specific mythology, the gunfight in the street, the quick-draw showdown, the perpetual state of armed confrontation, that is fiction. Period. So if cowboys were not shooting, what were they doing? They were sewing. That is not a joke. Cowboys carried sewing kits as standard equipment. In the slang of the period, the kit was called a housewife, a small fabric roll containing needles, thread, buttons, and a thimble tucked into the saddlebag alongside whatever other gear a man could afford. On a 2 to 4 month trail drive from Texas to Kansas, you could not replace a torn shirt. You could not buy new trousers. You mended what you had by firelight after a 15-hour day in the saddle. The housewife was as essential as the canteen. More essential, honestly, than a gun most of them did not carry. Picture it. A teenage boy, maybe 17, sitting cross-legged by a fire made from dried buffalo chips because there is no wood on the open plains. He is mending the knee of his only pair of wool trousers with a needle he can barely see in the flickering light. His hands are cracked from wind and rope and sun. Around him, 2,000 longhorns are bedded down for the night, and his shift on night watch starts in 4 hours. That is a cowboy. Beyond the sewing, the daily work of a trail drive was fence mending, saddle repair, doctoring sick cattle, digging post holes, hauling water, and nighttime guard shifts. The herd moved 10 to 15 miles a day, walking slowly. Stampedes happened, and when they did, a man might ride 15 or 20 hours straight, but most days were a slow grind of dust and patience. The primary skill of a working cowboy was not marksmanship. It was endurance. And if you are thinking that at least the food was good, campfire steak and beans, a jovial cook dishing out hearty meals, the record has more bad news. The trail diet was coffee brewed black enough to dissolve a spoon, biscuits or hardtack, salt pork, bacon, and dried beans. That was it. Fresh beef was consumed only when a steer was injured or had to be put down. Trail bosses did not slaughter healthy cattle. Those animals were the prophet, walking on 4 legs toward the Kansas railhead. Fresh vegetables and fruit were unavailable for months at a time. Scurvy and digestive problems were common on the longer drives. Charles Goodnight's chuck wagon, invented around 1866 from a surplus army wagon, was a genuine innovation, but it was a mobile pantry for preserved and dried goods, not a restaurant kitchen. The cowboys stank. That is blunt, but documented. On a drive lasting months, bathing opportunities were limited to river crossings, which were infrequent and terrifying. Andy Adams, A former trailhand whose 1903 account is considered among the most authentic descriptions of trail life, describes arriving cowboys as filthy enough to alarm townspeople. The combination of cattle dust, sweat, animal waste, and weeks without laundering produced something you could smell before you could see it, which is why a cowboy's first stop in town was not the saloon. It was the barber shop. 25 cents for a bath in a galvanized tin tub, water heated on a stove, and brownish from reuse. Lye soap that took the skin off along with the grime. Then a shave. Then, if he could afford it, new clothes. Then, and only then, the saloon. The drinking, when it came, was ferocious. Months of enforced sobriety on the trail, followed by arrival in a cattle town with money in your pocket and nothing to do until the next hiring season. E.C. Teddy Blue. Abbott, who dictated his memoirs in 1939, was blunt about it. The boredom, the cold, and the loneliness were worse than any danger, he said. And the loneliness was real. Hollywood romanticizes solitude as freedom. The Trail Diaries describe something closer to what we would now recognize as depression. Months away from any town, any family, any contact beyond a small crew of men as exhausted and filthy as yourself. For many, the work was not a romantic choice. It was economic necessity. They worked cattle because they had nothing else. If you grew up watching Westerns, I want you to hold something in your mind. Think of the cowboy as you have always pictured him. Clint Eastwood, maybe. John Wayne. A weathered man in his 40s, white, alone, morally certain. Now replace that image. The actual cowboy was often a teenager. He was frequently black or Mexican or of mixed heritage. The cowboy workforce was multiracial from the start, and the West knew it, even if Hollywood spent a century pretending otherwise. Philip Durham and Everett Jones documented the presence of black cowboys on virtually every major cattle trail and ranch operation in the post-Civil War period. Many were formerly enslaved men who had worked cattle in Texas before emancipation. They brought their skills with them into freedom, and they were hired because those skills were valuable. Bose Icard rode point for Charles Goodnight on the Goodnight Loving Trail. Point position. The front of the herd. The most skilled, the most trusted, the first to meet whatever the trail threw at them. Goodnight, a man not given to sentiment, had a headstone inscribed for Icard after his death. The words are in the record. Served with me 4 years on the Goodnight Loving Trail, never shirked a duty or disobeyed an order, rode with me in many stampedes, participated in 3 engagements with Comanches. Splendid behavior. Bill Pickett, a black cowboy of mixed heritage, invented bulldogging, steer wrestling, and performed in rodeos nationally. These were not exceptions at the margins. They were the workforce, and here is what cuts deepest. The entire material culture of American ranching, every piece of it, was inherited from Mexican vaqueros. The saddle with the horn for roping. The lariat from la reata. The technique of roping from horseback. The roundup from rodeo. Branding practices, open range management. Chaps from chaparreras. Spurs with large rowels. The bandana worn against dust. Even the word mustang from Mesteño. The vaquero tradition predated Anglo ranching by 2 centuries. The Spanish had been working cattle from horseback in the Americas since the 1500s. The Anglo cowboy did not invent his trade. He inherited it wholesale from Mexican horsemen who had been perfecting it for generations. And then the movies erased the teachers from the story, kept the tools, kept the vocabulary, erased the people. That is not a footnote. That is the central fact of cowboy history. If this is reshaping what you thought you knew, tell me in the comments which of these details hit you hardest. I read everyone. Even the hat was not what you think. The Stetson, boss of the plains, was introduced in 1865, but period photographs from the late 1860s and 1870s show cowboys wearing bowler hats, flat caps, Civil War kepis, sombreros, and shapeless felt hats that would embarrass a scarecrow. The Stetson gained dominance gradually through the 1880s on its practical merits. The wide brim blocked sun and rain, the high crown provided insulation, the felt could hold water for the horse. But the idea that every cowboy from the beginning wore a crisp white Stetson, color-coded for moral character, white for heroes, black for villains, that is a silent film invention, a visual shorthand for audiences who needed to tell the good guy from the bad guy in a black and white frame. There is one detail from the record that Hollywood got almost right, though it missed the reason. Cowboys did sing, but not around a campfire for entertainment. They sang to the cattle during night watch, low and monotonous, hour after hour in the dark. A calm human voice reassured restless longhorns. A sudden noise, a coyote, a crack of lightning, a sneeze, could trigger a stampede that would kill men and animals both. So the night herder sang, not the cheerful guitar ballads of the movies. Droning, repetitive chanting, adapted from hymns and folk songs, improvised when memory ran out. Singing, not for joy, but for survival. And when the survival failed, it was not bullets that killed. The leading causes of death for working cowboys were horse-related accidents: thrown, dragged, kicked, crushed, followed by drowning during river crossings, lightning strikes, and stampede injuries. Rivers were the nightmare. Swimming 2,000 cattle through a swollen, muddy river with no bridge and no rope stretched across. Horses losing footing, men swept downstream, quicksand-like mud at the banks where cattle piled up and horses panicked. Andy Adams described the terror of it. The brown water, the animal's eyes rolling white, the current pulling a man under. More cowboys died in rivers than in gunfights by a margin the record cannot precisely quantify, but that every trailhand who survived understood in his bones. The end, when it came, was not a slow fade. It was sudden, and it was cold. Joseph Glidden patented barbed wire in 1874. Cheap and effective, it allowed farmers and large ranchers to fence the open range. By the mid-1880s, the long cattle drive was becoming physically impossible. The trails were being cut by wire. And then, the winter of 1886 to 1887 delivered the killing blow. They called it the Great Die-Up. John Clay, a Scottish-born rancher in Wyoming and Montana, saw the aftermath with his own eyes and described it in terms that still carry the cold. Cattle frozen, standing up in snowdrifts. Carcasses piled against fence lines where animals had bunched together seeking shelter and died where they stood. Entire herds annihilated. Estimates range from 40 to 90% of cattle on the northern plains dead, depending on location. The range is wide because the records were chaotic and many ranchers simply walked away. The open-range cattle drive, as an industry, was finished within a few years. By the early 1890s, the working cowboy of the trail drive era was already a historical figure. Buffalo Bill was already turning him into a stage character. The dime novels were already writing the mythology. 20 years. The entire era lasted 20 years. And from that single generation of migrant laborers, teenagers and young men, black and white and Mexican, underpaid and overworked, sewing their own clothes by firelight on a treeless plain, America built a myth that has endured for more than a century. The real men deserved better than the myth. They deserved to be remembered as they were. Bose Icard, riding point through Comanche territory, trusted above all others and then written out of the movie. A 17-year-old from South Texas, threading a needle with cracked fingers, while 2,000 longhorns breathed in the darkness around him. A vaquero on a Spanish horse, braiding a rawhide riata with a skill his grandfather taught him. Working the same land his family had worked for generations before any Anglo cowboy existed. They were not gunslingers. They were not loners. They were workers. Young, tired, diverse, skilled in ways the movies never thought to show, and mortal in ways the movies never admitted. The next time you see a Western, watch for the sewing kit. You will not find one. That absence tells you everything about the distance between the story we were sold and the lives that were actually lived. If the documented West is the story you came here for, the real people, the real records, the version that is harder and stranger and more honest than the Hollywood cut, then stay with this channel. There is more to find, and the people who lived it deserve to have it found.